My book is titled Grace Abounds, A Holistic Case for Universal Salvation. And I basically draw on all of what I call holy tradition, which I explain in chapter 2, what I consider that, which would be scripture, the church fathers, the liturgical tradition, and I sort of draw all that together in the second part of the book, and I make a case for universalism. And then the third part of the book, I make a philosophical case for universalism. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, right? Some books only do philosophy, some only do history slash scripture. I kind of bring both together, and I go really deep on both. So you're not getting surface level on either, but at the same time, it's written to be readable. By people who are new to the topic. Like chapter 4 is basically an introduction to different variants on what positions you have in eschatology. For instance, there are people that are universalists and annihilationists and infernalists, and I explain each position. I kind of give some names people may be familiar with, C.S. Lewis, maybe people like that, right? And that's just to kind of get the reader into part 2 once it starts. So that they're not just blindsided out of nowhere, right? So before I start a new topic, the former chapter basically goes through an introduction of it. So that's the same for part 1, which was my theological section, which is all about scripture, the church, um, the incarnation itself. How do we understand the incarnation? Because I think it's important when we're talking about universalism that we contextualize it within the Christian message. I think that some books I don't want to name names, I'm really influenced by a lot of people, but I think that some books maybe don't go enough into the theology of Christianity as a whole, and they kind of just give universalism, right? But I think Christian universalism is so paramount to the idea of the incarnation and all of that. So I go through a theology of the incarnation as I title chapter 3, and all of part 1 is largely dedicated to the incarnation because I really want people to see that this is a Christian universalism. This isn't just universalism. This is a deeply Christian concept. And so then once I get into the history of universalism, people know, oh, well, I've already established this theological bedrock, right? So when I'm talking about the history, they're understanding that theology that those people believe that I've mentioned prior, many of the saints and so on, and how that history is pertinent to the theology that I've already introduced, right? So it kind of all comes together. And part 1 is necessary, but at the same time, it's not about universalism. It's about establishing a theological bedrock to then make an argument for universalism in parts 2 and 3. I also, in chapter 7, something that I haven't seen any universalists do is dive into the apocryphal gospels, and how those earliest manuscripts teach universalism. And I kind of, this is where some people may tune out, and that's fine. Some people aren't interested in, a development of conceptual development in apocryphal gospels through the centuries, but I think it's interesting to see how these earlier manuscripts taught universalism. Specifically, I'm talking about the text, the questions of Bartholomew and the Gospel of Nicodemus. And how these earlier manuscripts taught universalism, but I mean, we can literally see like a conscious effort by scribes moving into the later parts of the first millennium, editing out these lines about universal salvation. Like it's actually really wild. And Bart Ehrman, who's a secular scholar but great in his own right, he has a text 2023 where he basically introduces this sort of development, and I sort of trace his argument and add some stuff on my own. And so yeah, I think that I draw into the apocryphal text, which has never been done before. Draw on the Orthodox liturgy, which has never really been done in a systematic way. Chapter 10, I mentioned, is on Constantinople too. I think I can say this pretty confidently. I have the most detailed engagement with the conciliar reception of universal salvation and origin in the ecumenical councils on the market today. No holds bar. I spent about 65 pages going through the earlier local councils, which led up to Constantinople II, Constantinople II itself, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and the 1672 Council of Jerusalem. So, this is a lot of it is structured on Father Kimmel's chapter in his book, Destined for Joy, but I go far more in depth on parts that I think that he doesn't go much in depth on. And I also had the opportunity, and I thank him for responding, Father Richard Price, who's the leading scholar who's translated all these texts. I've had back and forth with him, and that's been really fruitful for my own intellectual development. And well, I've actually pointed out some stuff that he was like, yeah, I was actually wrong on that. So that was, that's always nice to see as well. when you can kind of, help a really the scholar you admire and they recognize their own faults. It's very humble of the father. So yeah, I really love chapter 10. I think it's sort of the crown jewel of the text. Frankly, if you would only buy it for chapter 10, I wouldn't have qualms. It's the most historical, it's the most scholarly, because I engage with Father Richard Price and people that helped me craft it, right? Chapter 14, I am the first English commentator to have any systematic engagement with Father Pavel Ferenski's chapter Gehenna in his wonderful Orthodox book, The Pillar and Ground of Truth. There are no English commentaries on this chapter, so I stake myself out and I kind of say, "Hey, I'm the first one. I have a lot to say." I think Father Pavel Ferensky he wrote this text in I think 1911, and it's like 900 pages, right? It's massive. It was only recently translated into English in the early 2000s, so it still hasn't gotten a lot of the scholarly attention, especially outside Orthodox circles, that I think it needs. And so I hope that my engagement with his arguments, which I think some are good, and sometimes I think that some are not so good. But I think that Father Pavel Ferensky still has something to say, and that all Orthodox people and even non-Orthodox people should read his work on Gehenna, because I think that he offers, and I'm confident saying this, the strongest Orthodox argument for eternal hell. I think he offers that, right? So I think that people that are universalists need to read his chapter on Gehenna, and I think that my engagement with it is also necessary as well. I think that I put to rest a lot of his concerns. One of the things, this is quite off topic, but the appendix of my book is something that's also never been done before. It's a comparison contrast between Christian arguments for universal salvation and Islamic arguments for universal salvation. So I look at the Islamic theologian named Ibn Taymiyyah, who was writing in about the 13th century, and he was a universalist. And so I look at his arguments for universal salvation, and I kind of show like, wait, these are like really similar philosophically to the arguments that Christians use, right? And then I look at his Quranic arguments and I go, wow, like the arguments he uses about linguistic terms, ayonos, there's this whole term in the Quran that's very similar, where it's like in a certain context it can mean forever, but in other contexts it can be more polyvalent, right? So I kind of say like, wow, that's really fascinating, right? Like Christian universalists, Islamic universalists have been drawing on like the same types of arguments, but have never really had contact. And I think that's very fascinating. I think it opens the door to a lot of new scholarship. But yeah, so that's sort of the overall gist. I think those are some of the things I cover that people might be interested in. So yeah.